When Fred was a kid back on Earth, maybe 5 or 6 years old, he'd seen a weed growing in the darkness of his uncle's cellar. The plant had been pale and thin, but twice as tall as the ones out in the side yard, deformed by reaching for the sunlight. The man behind the bar looked just like that. Too tall, too pale, too hungry for something he'd never had and never would. Belters were like that. The music in the bar mixed Punjabi rhythms with a high-voiced woman rapping in the polyglot mess of languages that made up Belter Creole. The battered pachinko machine in the back rang and skittered. Hashish smoke sweetened the air. Fred leaned back on a bar stool meant for someone 10 centimeters taller than he was and smiled gently. "Is there a fucking problem?" he asked. The bartender could have been Chinese or Korean or a mix of the two, which meant his family had probably come up in one of the first waves. 5 generations of grubbing for air, packing extended families into surveying ships with 7 bunks, looking back at the sun that was hardly more than the brightest star. It was hard to think of any of them as humans anymore. Hey guys, Pete here. In light of recent events, I wanted to do a video about Fred Johnson. I've been getting a lot of questions about the Belters in general on my Season 5 videos, and I think the short story about Fred, the butcher of Anderson Station, provides some great insight into life in the Belt and the struggles that Belters face. Before we get into the origin story of the Earther, who became the leader of the moderate faction of the Outer Planets Alliance, I think we should touch on the history of the Belt and how Belters came to be in the first place. We'll start there. So the name the Belt comes from the asteroid belt in our solar system between the orbits of Mars and Jupiter. As its name implies, it's a bunch of asteroids, big and small, all different shapes and sizes, that are grouped together in a belt orbiting the sun. These rocks are made up of significant amounts of valuable materials. Things like ice, which you can use for water, rare minerals, and precious metals. And they're just out there waiting to be claimed and then mined. It's a gold rush waiting to happen. It's just currently they're out of our reach. Roughly 130 years before the events in the Expanse pick up, a Martian engineer named Solomon Epstein invents what will become to be known as the Epstein drive. Without getting too far into the details, the Epstein drive is a really efficient fusion drive that makes it possible for humanity to explore and colonize our solar system. At the time of its invention, Mars was still a colony of Earth. They'd been wanting to break away, so they shared this technology for their independence, and that opened the door for both planets to go out and extract those resources I was just talking about. As that extraction was taking place, we had people who relocated to these colonies indefinitely. Those are the original Belters. For additional context, on Earth at that time, there were a number of factors that would contribute to people wanting to go out to the Belt to try to strike it rich. Due to the increased population, there's literally not enough jobs to go around. So about half of the population lives on a sustenance level basic income and are literally not allowed to work. There's also limitations on who can have children. You have to pay a big tax to do it legally. So as you can imagine, there's a ready-made population for an opportunity like this. I mentioned it was a gold rush waiting to happen, and I think of it as being similar to the California gold rush in the 19th century. You had this mass migration of people going there trying to get rich, but if you know the history of it, the reality is not many of the miners actually did. The real fortunes of the gold rush were the people who were selling these guys materials, selling them food, and overpriced tools and supplies. Belters become a new exploitable class of laborers who, after a few generations of living in low G, start to develop differently than humans that grew up in Earth's gravity, and that further otherizes them. They're taller, thinner, and their bones become brittle in a way that makes living in gravity very difficult. These differences also make it easier for people from Earth and Mars to dehumanize them. They call them skinnies. They see them basically as second-class citizens, and as you might imagine, this all sets the table for conflict. I suppose for practical reasons, the show doesn't really depict them as they are in the book. We see a little bit of that whenever Avasarala tortures a suspected OPA terrorist, but generally speaking, we don't see the differences in characters like Miller or Naomi. Instead, the show plays up the cultural differences a little bit more. So instead of being really tall and skinny people with tattoos and speaking Belter Creole, the tattoos and the Belter Creole is what gives them away. Anderson Station is a ore refinery that's pretty remote because it's on the other side of the belt from where Ceres is. We saw it depicted in episode 105 on the show, and the stories are a little different book to show, so I'm just going to generalize the idea of what happened there. The massacre of Anderson Station was in response to a group of workers who took control of the station. The administrator from the Earth-Mars Coalition added a surcharge of 3% onto supply transfers. So you have this captured workforce, where else are they going to go, that are barely getting by in an environment where people can't naturally live. You need air, you need water, you need all these different things that just don't exist there. So when discussing this 3% increase, it doesn't sound like a lot. The Belter's dilemma is, what do? Do you go without air for 3 days out of the year? Do you go without food for 3 days? You get the idea. There's also an issue with their children who are suffering from a condition known as cerebral hypoxia from developing in a situation where there's a low concentration of oxygen in the air. The group in charge, the Anderson Hayosung group, refused to provide them with aid, and in the show they won't even recognize that there's something happening to them. So the miners took over the station and went on strike. This led to the corporation labeling them as terrorists and calling in the UN and Navy to help them with the situation. In the show, they say this happened 11 years before season 1, and we watch mostly through the perspective of the striking miners. In the novella, we have 2 separate timelines. When it opens, which is where that excerpt I read at the beginning came from, Fred Johnson has resigned from the Marine Corps, made a public statement apologizing for what happened, and now he's generally hanging around drinking at bars in the belt. Some of Anderson Dawes' men come into the bar and abduct him. They have a conversation. He basically calls Fred out for being suicidal. He says he's seen it a million times. He's seen guys that are about to take themselves out, and there's always this part before, taking risks, hoping the universe will do it for you, make it easy. Fred doesn't necessarily deny this, and you do get the sense that he is in a period of self-loathing and he's having a hard time dealing with what happened. Anderson Dawes is actually really familiar with what happened on the station because the security camera footage recorded everything, and that got out. So the Marine, Colonel Fred Johnson, brought an attack team to retake this station. In alternating chapters, Fred recounts this in his own mind as it happened, and Anderson Dawes asks him questions about it, while Fred tries to figure out why he abducted him in the first place. Since, as I mentioned, the details are different, the bottom line of the attack is that Fred did everything he was supposed to do. He acted professionally, he had to make some tough choices based on what he encountered, and a lot of people died. There were about 10,000 people who lived and worked on Anderson Station, and over 1,000 of them died. In both the book and the show, they were trying to surrender, but because their comms were being jammed, Fred didn't get this message. The assault was caught by the surveillance cameras, and that was broadcasted across the entire system. Back on Earth, Fred was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions, but then also because that footage got out, he became known as the Butcher of Anderson Station. What he learned later was that the UN had received their communication about the surrender, and basically they decided to make an example out of them anyway, because they were counting on no one ever finding out about the message. Fred figured this out, and this is from his conversation with Dawes. I killed him because he wanted her to have enough air to breathe, Fred said. I killed her daddy while he was trying to surrender, and they gave me a medal for doing it. So there you go. That's what happened on Anderson Station. What are you going to do about it? Dawes shook his head. That's too easy. You killed lots of daddies. What made this one different? Fred started to speak, stopped, tried again. They used me. They made it about sending messages to everyone that you don't fuck with Earth. Because look at the shit we'll do just because you spaced an administrator on a nowhere station. They made me the poster boy for disproportional response. They made me a butcher. While they're talking, Dawes tells him a story about killing his own sister when they were teenagers. Not on purpose and not through an act of violence, but by not thoroughly checking the seals on her suit like he was supposed to. It drives home how difficult it is to live in space and how people who grow up there turn out different. He talks about how inners are wasteful, and we learn that the reason that he's questioning Fred is because he can't have him going around antagonizing people in the belt until someone kills him. He may be the butcher to belters, but he's the hero of Anderson Station in the inner planets, and the OPA can't take the bad press if someone takes him out. Dawes says, "I don't waste resources, Colonel. If you want to die, it will do that girl and her father absolutely no good. If you want to make it up to her and all the people like her, I could use your expertise. You're a rare resource. You've got knowledge and training, and as the man who is famous throughout the whole system for killing Belters, you're in a position to be our strongest advocate." So based on the way he answered things, Dawes recruits Fred into the OPA, and he holds up his end of the deal. He does advocate for Belters. He tries to improve conditions for them where he can, and eventually he'll represent the largest faction of Belters as an Earther, and he's actually able to be recognized by the United Nations and the Martian Republic. Over the years, we see him deal directly with their leaders, and once he gets the protomolecule sample, they sort of have to listen to him, and he does have a voice in decisions that are made. So he's a super interesting character, and I really like this origin story. And I think that's a good place to end it. In the comments, let me know what you think about Fred Johnson. Let me know if you have any questions about him or the belt in general, and I'll try to answer what I can. The Butcher of Anderson Station is actually really short. It's more like an essay than a novella even, but I'll put a link in the description of the video if you want to check it out. It definitely adds depth to the character, and I don't think you'll be disappointed. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Thanks for watching. I'll talk to you soon.